Sarah Martinez had always been different from other prison guards. While her colleagues focused on maintaining order through fear and intimidation, she believed in treating prisoners with basic human dignity. At 32 years old, she had worked at Riverside Correctional Facility for 8 years, earning respect from both staff and inmates for her fair but firm approach. The facility housed over 2,000 prisoners, many serving long sentences for serious crimes. Sarah worked the maximum security wing where the most dangerous inmates were kept. Despite the challenging environment, she had never experienced a serious incident until that cold February morning when everything changed. It started as a routine day. Sarah arrived at 6 in the morning for her shift, greeting the night guards, and checking the overnight reports. Nothing seemed unusual. The prisoners were having breakfast in the cafeteria when the first sign of trouble appeared. Marcus Thompson, a lifer serving time for armed robbery, approached her during his meal. "Guard Martinez," he said quietly, "something big is happening today. You need to be careful." Sarah had known Marcus for 5 years. He was one of the few inmates she trusted completely. His warning sent chills down her spine, but before she could ask for details, chaos erupted throughout the facility. The prison riot began in the East Wing during breakfast. A fight between rival gangs quickly escalated when other inmates joined in. Within minutes, the entire cafeteria was in chaos. Tables were overturned, makeshift weapons appeared, and the sound of breaking glass filled the air. Sarah immediately radioed for backup and tried to evacuate the remaining peaceful inmates from the danger zone, but the riot was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. Prisoners were breaking out of their cells, overwhelming the guards, and taking control of entire sections of the prison. During the confusion, a group of escaped prisoners cornered Sarah in a hallway. She recognized most of them, men she had treated fairly during their time at Riverside. But prison riots change people, and desperation can make anyone dangerous. "We're not going to hurt you, Martinez," said Jake Williams, who was serving time for drug trafficking. "But you're coming with us. You're our insurance." Sarah knew that resisting would only make things worse. She allowed herself to be led to the prison library where dozens of other hostages, guards, kitchen staff, and administrative personnel were being held. The inmates had barricaded the doors and windows, creating a fortress within the prison. Outside, police sirens wailed as law enforcement agencies from across the state rushed to Riverside. The media arrived shortly after, setting up cameras and broadcasting live coverage of the unfolding crisis. Sarah's husband, David, watched the news at home with growing horror as reporters described the hostage situation. The prisoners' demands were simple but impossible to meet immediately. They wanted better living conditions, improved medical care, and investigations into guard brutality. Some also demanded reduced sentences or transfers to different facilities. The negotiations would clearly take time, and Sarah realized she might be trapped for days or even weeks. As night fell on the first day, Sarah found herself in a surreal situation. The prisoners had organized themselves remarkably well. They assigned guards to watch the hostages, established a communication system with the outside negotiators, and even arranged for food and water to be distributed. What surprised Sarah most was how many inmates went out of their way to ensure she was treated well. Men she had shown kindness to over the years now returned that favor, making sure she had a comfortable place to sleep and adequate food. They remembered every small act of respect she had shown them, but not all prisoners were friendly. Some harbored deep resentment against all guards, and Sarah could feel their hostile stares. She knew that as the standoff continued, tensions would rise and the situation could turn violent at any moment. Marcus Thompson approached her on the second night. "You saved my nephew from those bullies last year," he whispered. "I won't let anything happen to you." He had positioned himself near Sarah's sleeping area, acting as an unofficial bodyguard. The outside world believed the worst. News reports suggested that the hostages were in grave danger, with some prisoners reportedly becoming increasingly unstable. Sarah's family was devastated, fearing they might never see her again. But inside the library, Sarah was observing something remarkable. Despite being criminals, Many of the prisoners were showing organizational skills and leadership qualities that the regular prison system had never recognized or developed. They were solving problems, mediating disputes, and maintaining order among themselves. She began to understand that many of these men had simply never been given the chance to demonstrate their better qualities. The prison system had treated them as animals for so long that they had started believing it themselves. But when given responsibility and respect, they rose to the occasion. As the days passed, Sarah found herself becoming an unofficial mediator between the more reasonable prisoners and the angry, desperate ones. Her years of experience dealing with different personalities in the prison environment proved invaluable. She could sense when tensions were building and often managed to defuse potentially explosive situations. The prisoners began consulting her about their demands and negotiation strategies. They valued her insights about how the outside authorities might respond to different proposals. Sarah realized she was no longer just a hostage. She was becoming part of their team. By the end of the first week, the dynamic had shifted completely. Sarah was moving freely among the prisoners, helping to organize meal distribution, mediating disputes, and even participating in planning sessions about their demands. The other hostages watched in amazement as she gained the trust and respect of their captors. But Sarah knew the situation couldn't last forever. Outside, pressure was mounting on the authorities to end the standoff by force if necessary. She could hear helicopters circling overhead and knew that tactical teams were preparing for a possible assault on the library. The prisoners sensed it too. Some became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the authorities would storm the building and kill everyone inside. Others began talking about surrender, fearing that continued resistance would only lead to longer sentences or worse. Sarah realized that she was in a unique position to influence the outcome of the crisis. The prisoners trusted her, and she understood both their legitimate grievances and the reality of their situation. She began working behind the scenes, using her relationships with individual inmates to gradually build support for a peaceful resolution. Her transformation from hostage to leader was complete when the prisoners formally asked her to represent them in direct negotiations with the authorities. They had come to see her not as their captor, but as their advocate, someone who understood their problems and could communicate their needs to the outside world. The stage was set for an ending that no one could have predicted when the crisis began. The second week of the standoff brought unexpected developments that would change everything. Sarah had become the unofficial spokesperson for the prisoners, a role she never imagined herself in. The warden, Robert Harrison, initially refused to negotiate with her, insisting she was suffering from Stockholm Syndrome and couldn't think clearly. But as Sarah demonstrated her clear thinking and detailed knowledge of the prisoners' legitimate concerns, even the hardened negotiation team began to take her seriously. She presented their demands in a rational, organized manner that surprised everyone listening. "These men aren't monsters," Sarah explained during a phone call with the lead negotiator. "They're human beings who have been treated like animals for years. Some of their demands are completely reasonable, and addressing them could prevent future incidents like this." Inside the library, Sarah had discovered things about the prison system that shocked her. Prisoners showed her evidence of medical neglect, including photos of untreated injuries and testimonies about denied medications. They documented cases of guard brutality that had been covered up by the administration. One prisoner, Tommy Rodriguez, had been denied his heart medication for 3 months as punishment for a minor infraction. Another, elderly William Foster, had been forced to sleep on a concrete floor despite his arthritis because his mattress was taken away as discipline. These weren't hardened criminals plotting revenge. They were desperate people fighting for basic human dignity. Sarah realized that her 8 years as a guard had only shown her part of the picture. She had tried to be fair and respectful, but she hadn't seen the systematic problems that existed throughout the facility. The riot wasn't just about anger or violence. It was about people who had reached their breaking point. The prisoners organized themselves into committees to address different issues. They had a medical committee documenting health problems, a food committee addressing nutritional concerns, and a safety committee documenting instances of abuse. Sarah was amazed by their organizational skills and attention to detail. Marcus, Thompson emerged as one of the key leaders despite his quiet personality. He had spent years observing the prison system and understood exactly what needed to change. "We're not asking for luxury," he told Sarah. "We just want to be treated like human beings." The media coverage began to shift as details about prison conditions leaked out. Investigative reporters started looking into Riverside Correctional Facility's history and uncovered a pattern of problems that had been ignored for years. Public opinion slowly began changing from viewing the prisoners as dangerous criminals to seeing them as people fighting against an unfair system. Sarah's family was torn between relief that she appeared safe and confusion about her apparent cooperation with her captors. Her husband David gave several interviews defending her actions and expressing pride in her courage. "Sarah has always stood up for what's right," he said. "She's trying to save lives in there." But not everyone approved of Sarah's role. Some guards union representatives criticized her publicly, claiming she was betraying her colleagues and endangering other hostages. They argued that negotiating with prisoners only encouraged more violence and riots. The tension between different groups of prisoners was another challenge Sarah had to navigate. The older, more experienced inmates generally supported peaceful negotiations, but younger prisoners were impatient and wanted immediate action. Gang loyalties also created complications, as different groups had different priorities and grievances. Sarah spent hours each day talking with individual prisoners, listening to their stories and understanding their concerns. She learned about fathers who hadn't seen their children in years due to restrictive visiting policies, about men who had been denied educational opportunities that could help them after release, and about the psychological damage caused by long periods in solitary confinement. One conversation particularly affected her. James Parker, serving life without parole for murder, told her about his transformation during 15 years in prison. He had earned his GED, completed several vocational training programs, and mentored younger inmates to help them avoid violence. But the prison system offered him no recognition for his growth and no opportunity to contribute meaningfully to society. "I know I can never undo what I did," James told her, "but I could help other kids avoid making the same mistakes. Instead, I'm just warehoused here until I die. What's the point of rehabilitation if no one believes people can change?" These conversations helped Sarah understand that the prison system was failing everyone, guards, prisoners, and society as a whole. Instead of preparing people for successful reintegration into the community, it was creating more anger and desperation. The breakthrough came when Sarah proposed a radical solution. Instead of just addressing the immediate demands, she suggested creating a pilot program that would fundamentally change how the prison operated. Her idea was to give prisoners more responsibility and autonomy while maintaining security. She envisioned prisoner-run committees that would have real authority over aspects of daily life like meal planning, recreational activities, and conflict resolution. Guards would focus on security while prisoners would handle many administrative and social functions. The prisoners were immediately interested in her proposal. They had already demonstrated their ability to organize and govern themselves during the standoff. Many had skills and experience that could benefit the entire facility if properly utilized. But selling the idea to the outside authorities was much more difficult. The warden and state corrections officials were skeptical about giving prisoners more power and responsibility. They worried about security risks and political backlash from those who believed prisoners should be punished, not empowered. Sarah used her unique position to bridge the gap between both sides. She understood the legitimate security concerns of the authorities, while also appreciating the prisoners' need for dignity and meaningful activity. Her proposals addressed both sets of concerns. She suggested starting with small pilot programs that could be carefully monitored and evaluated. Successful initiatives could then be expanded, while problems could be quickly addressed. This gradual approach made the authorities more comfortable with experimenting. The negotiations were complex because they involved multiple stakeholders: the state corrections department, the local police, the FBI, prison officials, guards unions, and various prisoner representatives all had different interests and concerns. Sarah found herself working 18-hour days, moving between different groups and helping them understand each other's perspectives. She was exhausted but energized by the possibility of creating real change. As the second week ended, a tentative agreement was taking shape. It wasn't everything the prisoners wanted, but it included significant improvements in medical care, food quality, educational opportunities, and disciplinary procedures. More importantly, it established mechanisms for ongoing dialogue and gradual reform. The authorities agreed to Sarah's pilot program proposal, though on a limited scale initially. A small group of selected prisoners would be given additional responsibilities and privileges as a test case. If successful, the program would be expanded. But some prisoners remained skeptical about whether the authorities would keep their promises once the crisis ended. They had been disappointed too many times before and worried that any agreements would be forgotten as soon as the media attention died down. Sarah understood their concerns and worked to build in accountability mechanisms and external oversight. She insisted that independent monitors be allowed regular access to the facility and that prisoners have formal channels for reporting problems. The stage was set for a resolution, but everyone knew that the real test would come after the immediate crisis ended. The third week brought the most critical phase of negotiations. Sarah had gained unprecedented access to both sides of the conflict, but she was also becoming physically and emotionally exhausted. The constant pressure of mediating between desperate prisoners and frustrated authorities was taking its toll. The breakthrough moment came when Sarah convinced the warden to visit the library personally. Robert Harrison had been managing the crisis from his office, relying on reports from others. But Sarah argued that he needed to see the situation firsthand to understand what was really happening. "Warden Harrison," she said during one of their phone conversations, "these men have organized themselves better than some of your staff. They've maintained order, prevented violence, and created detailed proposals for reform. You need to see this for yourself." Harrison was reluctant at first, worried about the security risks of entering the occupied library. But Sarah guaranteed his safety, and she had earned enough credibility that he decided to trust her judgment. When Harrison entered the library, he was shocked by what he saw. Instead of chaos and destruction, he found a well-organized community. The prisoners had divided the space into different areas for sleeping, eating, meetings, and recreation. They had established schedules for activities and created systems for handling disputes peacefully. Marcus Thompson gave the warden a tour, explaining how they had organized themselves and showing him the evidence they had compiled about problems in the prison system. Harrison was particularly impressed by their detailed documentation and rational approach to problem solving. "We're not trying to destroy the prison," Marcus explained. "We want to make it better for everyone, guards, prisoners, and the community. We all have to live here together." The visit changed Harrison's perspective completely. He began to see the prisoners as people with legitimate concerns rather than just security threats. More importantly, he started to believe that Sarah's reform proposals might actually work. But the political pressure from outside was intensifying. The governor was facing criticism for allowing the standoff to continue for so long. Conservative politicians were calling for a forceful end to the crisis, arguing that negotiating with prisoners set a dangerous precedent. Sarah found herself caught between increasing demands for action from authorities and growing impatience from some prisoners, who feared they were being stalled while tactical teams prepared for an assault. The tension reached a breaking point when a group of younger prisoners, led by Danny Martinez, threatened to take more dramatic action if their demands weren't met immediately. Danny had been in solitary confinement for 6 months before the riot and was consumed with anger at the entire system. "They're just buying time," Danny argued during a heated prisoner meeting. "They're going to storm this place and kill us all. We should take more hostages and make stronger demands while we still can." Sarah knew that if Danny's faction gained control, all hope for a peaceful resolution would be lost. She also understood that his anger came from genuine trauma. Solitary confinement had documented psychological effects that could drive people to desperation. She spent an entire night talking with Danny, listening to his experiences and helping him understand the progress that had been made. She didn't dismiss his concerns but showed him evidence that the negotiations were genuine and producing real results. "Danny, I've seen the draft agreements," she told him. They're not perfect, but they include specific timelines and accountability measures. More importantly, they establish ongoing processes for additional changes. This is just the beginning, not the end. Gradually, Sarah helped Danny see that his goals would be better served by supporting the negotiated settlement than by escalating the conflict. She also worked with the other prisoner leaders to find ways to address Danny's specific concerns about solitary confinement within the broader agreement. The medical situation among the hostages was becoming another concern. Several guards had chronic health conditions that required regular medication. Sarah worked with the prisoner leadership to ensure that medical needs were addressed, but she realized that the standoff couldn't continue indefinitely without serious health risks. Dr. Patricia Williams, one of the prison medical staff who had been taken hostage, became Sarah's ally in addressing health issues. She was surprised to discover how much medical knowledge some prisoners had gained from necessity, and she began documenting the medical neglect that had contributed to the crisis. Guard Martinez, Dr. Williams told her, "I've learned more about the real health problems in this prison during the past 3 weeks than in my previous 2 years working here. We need to completely overhaul our medical services." The prisoner committees had also uncovered evidence of financial corruption within the prison system. They showed Sarah documentation of overcharging for basic supplies, kickback schemes with vendors, and misuse of funds intended for prisoner programs. This information gave Sarah additional leverage in negotiations. The authorities were eager to prevent this evidence from becoming public, and they were more willing to make concessions to avoid a scandal that could reach high levels of state government. But Sarah was careful to use this information ethically. She wasn't interested in destroying careers or creating new problems. She wanted to fix the existing system. She focused on getting commitments for transparency and reform, rather than threatening exposure. The media coverage had evolved significantly during the 3 weeks. Initial reports focused on the drama and danger of the hostage situation, but journalists were now investigating the underlying issues that had caused the crisis. A series of articles in the state's largest newspaper documented the conditions at Riverside Correctional Facility and compared them to national standards for prison management. The reports created public pressure for reform and made politicians more supportive of negotiated solutions. Sarah's role in the crisis had made her a public figure, though she tried to avoid the spotlight. Reporters wanted interviews, and she received letters from people across the country supporting her efforts. She was surprised to learn that similar problems existed in prisons nationwide, and that her story was inspiring reform efforts elsewhere. The final negotiations were incredibly complex because they had to address multiple audiences. The prisoners needed to feel that their sacrifices had achieved meaningful change. The authorities needed to maintain faith and demonstrate that they were still in control. The public needed reassurance that justice was being served. Sarah worked tirelessly to craft language that would satisfy all these requirements. She helped develop implementation timelines, oversight mechanisms, and accountability measures that would ensure the agreements were more than empty promises. One of her key insights was that sustainable reform required buy-in from the guard staff, as well as prisoners. She worked to include provisions for guard training, improved working conditions for staff, and better communication between all levels of the prison hierarchy. The guards' union was initially resistant, viewing any concessions to prisoners as criticism of their work, but Sarah helped them understand that many of the proposed changes would actually make their jobs easier and safer. Better programs and conditions for prisoners means less tension and fewer security problems, she explained to union representatives. When people have hope and meaningful activities, they're much less likely to cause trouble. As the 3rd week ended, a comprehensive agreement was nearly complete. It included immediate improvements in medical care, food service, and living conditions, along with longer-term commitments to educational programs, job training, and family visitation policies. More importantly, it established Sarah's pilot program for prisoner self-governance in designated areas of the facility. A carefully selected group of long-term prisoners would be given responsibility for managing various aspects of daily operations under professional supervision. The agreement also created an independent monitoring board with authority to investigate complaints and ensure compliance with the new policies. This external oversight was crucial for maintaining prisoner trust in the reform process. But everyone knew that signing an agreement was just the first step. The real challenge would be implementing these changes in a way that created lasting transformation, rather than temporary improvements. The moment of truth arrived on a Tuesday morning during the fourth week. Sarah stood before the assembled prisoners in the library, holding the final negotiated agreement that would end the standoff. The document was thick, containing detailed provisions that addressed most of their major concerns. But selling the agreement to the prisoners was more challenging than negotiating with the authorities. After 3 weeks of solidarity and hope, some inmates were reluctant to give up their newfound power and return to the normal prison routine, even with promised improvements. Sarah addressed their concerns directly. "This agreement isn't perfect," she admitted, "but it's the beginning of real change. We've established mechanisms for ongoing reform and external oversight that will continue long after this crisis ends." She went through the document page by page, explaining each provision and how it would be implemented. The improvements were substantial: new medical protocols that guaranteed timely treatment, improved food services with prisoner input on menus, expanded educational and vocational programs, and revised disciplinary procedures that included prisoner representation in hearings. Most importantly, the agreement included Sarah's pilot program for prisoner self-governance. 20 carefully selected long-term inmates would be given significant responsibility for managing housing units, organizing recreational activities, and mediating conflicts under professional supervision. Marcus Thompson spoke in favor of accepting the agreement. "We've accomplished something here that no prison riot in history has achieved," he told the group. "We've negotiated real reforms with accountability mechanisms. If we reject this and fight to the end, we'll lose everything and probably get people killed." But Danny Martinez remained skeptical. "How do we know they won't just ignore these promises? Once we surrender," he asked. "They've lied to prisoners before." Sarah understood his concerns and had an answer prepared. "Because the world is watching now," she explained. "The media attention means they can't just forget about this. Plus, we have independent monitors and legal advocates who will hold them accountable." The debate among prisoners continued for hours. Some wanted to hold out for even better terms, while others feared that continued resistance would lead to a violent assault that could result in deaths. Sarah listened to all perspectives and helped facilitate the discussion. Finally, a vote was called. By a margin of 63 to 22, the prisoners agreed to accept the negotiated settlement. The standoff would end peacefully, with all hostages released unharmed and no criminal charges filed against prisoners for their participation in the negotiations. But the agreement came with conditions. The prisoners would return to their cells, gradually over 3 days, allowing time for the implementation of immediate reforms to begin. Sarah would remain in the library until the last prisoner was safely returned to housing, ensuring continuity and preventing any misunderstandings. The release process began that afternoon. The oldest and most vulnerable hostages were freed first, followed by medical staff and administrative personnel. Each group was debriefed by authorities and medical personnel to ensure they were physically and psychologically stable. Sarah was amazed by what she heard from the other hostages. Instead of trauma and anger, many expressed understanding and even sympathy for their captors. They had witnessed the same transformation that Sarah experienced, seeing prisoners as human beings with legitimate grievances rather than just criminals. Guard Robert Chen, who had been hostile toward prisoners throughout his 5-year career, told investigators, "I learned more about these men in 3 weeks than in all my previous time working here. Some of them are genuinely trying to better themselves, and we've been treating them like animals." The media coverage of the hostage releases was overwhelmingly positive. Instead of angry, traumatized victims, reporters found thoughtful people who spoke about the complexity of the prison system and the need for reform. This coverage helped build public support for the negotiated changes. But Sarah knew that the real test was yet to come. Implementing the agreement would require sustained effort and commitment from people throughout the system. She had learned that creating change on paper was much easier than making it work in practice. The first night after the hostage releases, Sarah remained in the library with about 30 prisoners who had volunteered to be the last to return to their cells. These were the men who had taken the biggest risks during the standoff and were most concerned about potential retaliation. They spent the evening talking about the future and how to make the reforms successful. Sarah was struck by their insights into what would and wouldn't work within the prison culture. They understood dynamics and relationships that would be invisible to outside administrators. The key is proving to the other prisoners that these changes are real, explained James Parker. If they see that the pilot program participants are actually getting better treatment and opportunities, they'll support the reforms. But if it looks like just another prison scam, we'll have bigger problems than before. Sarah took detailed notes of their suggestions and incorporated them into her recommendations for implementing the agreement. She realized that her role was evolving from crisis mediator to reform advocate, and she was determined to ensure the changes would succeed. The next morning, Warden Harrison visited the library to personally oversee the final prisoner returns. He had been transformed by the experience almost as much as Sarah, and he was committed to making the reforms work. But he was also nervous about the challenges ahead. "Guard Martinez," he told Sarah privately, "you've accomplished something remarkable here, but now comes the hard part, making it last. I'm going to need your help to implement these changes properly." Sarah had been expecting this conversation. Over the past few weeks, she had realized that she could no longer return to her old job as a regular guard. She had gained too much knowledge and earned too much trust from prisoners to go back to the traditional adversarial relationship. "Warden, I think I can serve the facility better in a new role," she replied. "I'd like to become the prisoner advocate and reform coordinator. Someone needs to bridge the gap between administration and inmates to make sure these changes actually happen." Harrison agreed immediately. Sarah's new position would be unique in the state corrections system, a staff member specifically responsible for representing prisoner interests while working within the administrative structure. It was an experiment that could revolutionize prison management if successful. The final prisoner return took place on Thursday afternoon. Marcus Thompson was the last to leave the library, symbolically handing Sarah the keys that the prisoners had taken from guards during the initial riot. The gesture was photographed by media and became an iconic image of peaceful conflict resolution. As Marcus walked back to his cell, he stopped and spoke to Sarah one final time. "You kept your word to us," he said simply. "Now we'll keep ours to you. We'll make this work." The library was empty for the first time in nearly a month. Sarah stood alone in the space where she had been transformed from a hostage into a leader, from a guard into an advocate. The tables and chairs were back in their proper places, but everything else had changed. Outside, the media was already declaring the Riverside crisis a success story. Political leaders were taking credit for the peaceful resolution and corrections. Officials were discussing how to apply similar approaches to other facilities. But Sarah knew that the real work was just beginning. The pilot program would start the following Monday with 20 carefully selected prisoners taking on new responsibilities. Sarah would work closely with them to develop protocols and procedures that could eventually be expanded throughout the facility. She also had to help regular guards adapt to the new relationship with prisoners. Many staff members were skeptical about the changes and worried that giving prisoners more power would make their jobs more dangerous. Sarah would need to provide training and support to help everyone adjust. The Independent Monitoring Board would begin its work within 2 weeks, providing external oversight and accountability for the reform process. Sarah would serve as the primary liaison between the monitors and the prison, ensuring they had access to accurate information about implementation progress. As Sarah finally left the library, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just 4 weeks. She had started as a guard doing her job and become a pioneer in prison reform. The experience had been terrifying, exhausting, and ultimately transformative. But she also knew that her biggest challenges lay ahead. Converting a negotiated agreement into lasting change would require persistence, creativity, and courage. The prisoners were counting on her to keep the promises that had ended the crisis peacefully. 6 months after the crisis ended, Sarah Martinez stood in her new office reviewing progress reports from the pilot program. Her title was now Prisoner Advocate and Reform Coordinator, a position that didn't exist anywhere else in the state correction system. The results so far exceeded everyone's expectations. The 20 prisoners selected for the pilot program had transformed their housing units. Violence was down 70%, medical complaints had dropped dramatically, and educational program participation had increased by over 200%. More importantly, the changes were spreading to other areas of the prison as regular inmates saw the benefits. Marcus Thompson had become the unofficial leader of the pilot program participants. His housing unit operated like a small community, with prisoners taking responsibility for cleanliness, conflict resolution, and peer counseling. Guards still maintained security, but their role had shifted from constant surveillance to supportive oversight. The difference is that we're treated like adults now, Marcus explained to a visiting state legislator. When people have responsibility and respect, they act responsibly and respectfully. It's not complicated. But implementing the reforms hadn't been easy. Sarah faced resistance from some guards who felt threatened by the changes, prisoners who were suspicious of any cooperation with authorities, and administrators who worried about political backlash if anything went wrong. The most difficult challenge came 3 months after the crisis when a prisoner in the pilot program was caught with contraband. Critics immediately claimed this proved that giving prisoners more freedom was dangerous and demanded an end to the experiment. Sarah investigated the incident thoroughly and discovered that the prisoner, Tony Rodriguez, had been pressured by gang members outside the program to hide drugs for them. When he refused, they threatened his family. Rather than report the threats, he had accepted the contraband to protect his loved ones. Instead of ending the program, Sarah used the incident as an opportunity to strengthen it. She worked with the pilot program participants to develop better systems for identifying and addressing outside pressures. They created confidential reporting mechanisms and peer support networks that helped prisoners resist criminal influences. The incident actually increased trust between Sarah and the pilot. Program participants, they saw that she was committed to understanding problems and finding solutions rather than just looking for excuses to punish people. This trust became the foundation for even more successful reforms. The Independent Monitoring Board, led by retired Judge Patricia Washington, provided crucial external validation for the changes. Their monthly reports documented improvements in every area covered by the agreement: medical care, food service, educational opportunities, and disciplinary procedures. Judge Washington was particularly impressed by the conflict resolution mechanisms developed by the prisoners themselves. These men have created dispute resolution processes that are more effective than what I see in many courtrooms, she reported to the state legislature. They're preventing problems instead of just punishing people after conflicts occur. The success at Riverside was attracting attention from corrections professionals nationwide. Sarah found herself invited to conferences and training sessions to explain how the reforms worked. She was careful to emphasize that success required genuine commitment from all levels of the organization, not just policy changes on paper. During one presentation to wardens from across the region, Sarah explained her key insight. Prisoners are going to organize themselves whether we acknowledge it or not. The choice is whether that organization works with us or against us. When we give them positive ways to exercise leadership and responsibility, everyone benefits. The pilot program had also produced unexpected economic benefits. Maintenance costs were down because prisoners took better care of facilities they helped manage. Disciplinary hearings had decreased dramatically, saving administrative time and resources. Most importantly, the number of assaults on guards had dropped to nearly zero. Sarah's relationship with her husband David had grown stronger through the experience. Initially worried about her safety and confused by her changing role, he had gradually become one of her strongest supporters. He helped her process the emotional challenges of her work and celebrated her achievements. "I'm proud of what you're doing," he told her during one of their evening walks. "You're proving that people can change and that the system can change too. That gives me hope for a lot of other problems in our society." But Sarah was careful not to let success make her overconfident. She knew that sustaining reforms required constant attention and adaptation. What worked in the initial months might not continue to work as circumstances changed and new challenges emerged. One ongoing challenge was managing the expectations of prisoners who weren't yet part of the pilot program. Many wanted to be included immediately, and some became resentful when they had to wait. Sarah worked to expand opportunities gradually, while maintaining the quality and safety that made the program successful. She also had to navigate political pressures as election seasons brought new politicians with different views on criminal justice. Some candidates criticized the reforms as being soft on crime, while others used them as examples of innovative governance. Sarah tried to stay above partisan politics and focus on practical results. The transformation of individual prisoners was perhaps the most rewarding aspect of Sarah's new role. She watched men who had been written off by society develop leadership skills, educational achievements, and positive relationships. Many began mentoring younger inmates and working to prevent the kind of despair that had led to their own crimes. James Parker, who had been serving life without parole, became a powerful advocate for violence prevention. He developed programs to help young inmates understand the real consequences of their choices and find alternatives to criminal thinking. His work was credited with preventing several potential assaults and possibly saving lives. Danny Martinez, who had been among the most angry and resistant prisoners during the crisis, gradually became one of the program's strongest supporters. Working through his trauma from solitary confinement, he developed peer counseling skills that helped other prisoners deal with psychological challenges. Sarah showed me that anger without direction just destroys everything, including yourself, Danny reflected during a program evaluation. But anger with purpose can create positive change. Now I use my anger about injustice to motivate reforms instead of violence. The educational programs had expanded far beyond anyone's original expectations. The prison library, once the site of the hostage crisis, had become a thriving learning center. Prisoners were earning GED certificates, college credits, and vocational certifications at record rates. Dr. Patricia Williams, the prison medical officer who had been held hostage, had become one of Sarah's closest allies in implementing reforms. Together, they had completely overhauled the medical services, creating a system that emphasized prevention and early intervention rather than just emergency treatment. The health improvements have been remarkable, Dr. Williams reported to the monitoring board. When prisoners feel respected and have hope for their futures, their physical and mental health improves dramatically. We're seeing fewer chronic conditions and much better compliance with treatment recommendations. The success stories were accumulating, but Sarah never forgot the human cost of the system that had preceded the reforms. She kept files on prisoners who had suffered under the old policies, using their experiences to ensure that similar problems wouldn't recur. One case that particularly motivated her was that of Robert Kim, a prisoner who had died from a treatable infection just 2 months before the crisis began. His death had been preventable if he had received prompt medical attention, but bureaucratic delays and indifference had cost him his life. Sarah worked with Robert's family to establish a memorial fund that provided emergency medical assistance to prisoners' families. The fund also supported research into prison healthcare improvements and advocacy for policy changes at the state level. The ripple effects of the Riverside reforms were spreading to other facilities across the state. Wardens were requesting training and consultation on implementing similar programs. The State Corrections Department had officially endorsed the approach and was developing guidelines for expanding it. Sarah found herself traveling frequently to share her experiences and help other facilities adapt the reforms to their specific circumstances. Each prison had unique challenges and opportunities, requiring careful customization of the basic principles. During one visit to a women's facility, Sarah learned about different issues that affected female prisoners, particularly the challenges faced by mothers separated from their children. She worked with the staff there to develop family-centered programs that maintained important relationships while serving sentences. The most significant validation of the reforms came when the State Attorney General's office announced that it was dropping plans to build 2 new prisons. The improvements in behavior and recidivism at facilities implementing the reforms had reduced the projected need for additional capacity. "What we've learned is that people respond to how they're treated," Sarah told an audience of criminal justice professionals in London. "When we treat prisoners like dangerous animals, they often behave that way. When we treat them like human beings capable of growth and change, they usually rise to meet those expectations." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The Guards Union, which had initially opposed many of the reforms, presented Sarah with their annual award for innovation in corrections. They credited her with making their jobs safer and more fulfilling. "Working here used to be about surviving each shift and counting days until retirement," said Union President Robert Chen. "Now it's about being part of something meaningful that actually helps people and makes the community safer." As Sarah prepared for another day of work, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a routine guard shift to a leadership role in transforming the entire corrections system. The crisis that had seemed like the worst day of her career had become the catalyst for the most meaningful work of her life. She thought about all the prisoners who had successfully returned to their communities, the families who had been reunited, the victims who had found healing, and the staff who had discovered new purpose in their work. The ripple effects of change were spreading far beyond the walls of Riverside Correctional Facility. But Sarah knew that the work was never finished. Each new prisoner brought fresh challenges. Each policy change required careful monitoring, and each success story had to be balanced against the failures that still occurred. Sustainable reform required constant attention and continuous improvement. As she walked through the facility that morning, prisoners and staff alike greeted her with respect and appreciation. The young woman who had once been taken hostage in a prison riot had become the leader of a movement that was changing how society thought about justice, redemption, and human potential. The transformation was complete, but the mission continued. There were more prisons to reform, more lives to change, and more proof to provide that treating people with dignity and respect produced better results than punishment and dehumanization. Sarah Martinez had discovered that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the courage to see people as they could become rather than just as they are. In the end, that vision had freed not just the prisoners, but everyone who worked within the system she had helped create.